Welcome to KINE2253, Motor Development Across the Lifespan. This lecture will discuss the 9th chapter of Lifespan Motor Development, the 7th edition, by Haywood and Getchell. This lecture will also provide supplementary examples and explanations to help provide a deeper understanding of the book chapter. In Chapter 8, students examined the developmental changes in growth and maturation with a focus on total body and relative segmental growth. In Chapter 9, we will focus on the different organ systems and how changes in these systems reflect similar patterns as what we saw with overall growth and maturation. Specifically in this lecture, students will examine the developmental changes that take place across the lifespan in different organ systems, including the skeletal, muscular, adipose, endocrine, and nervous systems. We will discuss the interactions between different systems during development. We will review the extrinsic factors that affect these different organ systems during periods of rapid development. And lastly, students will learn how intrinsic or genetic factors impact early development, while extrinsic factors appear to have a greater influence on later development. Let's begin by first exploring the skeletal system. The skeletal system begins with what is called the cartilage model. What is meant by this is that the cartilage serves as the basis for the structure and shape of bones. In the first part of this diagram, we see the cartilage model has multiple parts. There is a perichondrium, which is the outer layer. At the top, we see the proximal epiphysis. In the proximal epiphysis, we also see that there's hyaline cartilage, which will eventually create the supportive cushion between the bones. There's a diaphysis, which is the shaft of the bone, and the distal epiphysis. As we see in part 2 of the diagram, growth occurs by cell division of chondrocytes found in the middle of the diaphysis. In part 3 of the diagram, the blood supply forms in the diaphysis, providing nutrients. Without the blood supply, the bone cannot grow, so any injury or disease that affects the blood supply will affect its growth. As we can see in part 3 of this diagram, the primary ossification center is found in the mid-portion of the long bone in the diaphysis. Here, the blood supply develops and provides nutrients necessary for growth. In part 4 of the diagram, we can see that during development, the middle of the diaphysis grows in size at the edges of the ossification zone. Here we can see calcification of cartilage and the addition of osteoblasts, or bone-forming cells. The medullary cavity, where red and yellow bone marrow, stem cells, and red and white blood cells are formed and stored. This medullary cavity is formed as osteoclasts, or bone-resorbing cells, break down the bone from the inside walls of the diaphysis. The secondary ossification center is found in the epiphysis of the bone, as seen in part 5 of this diagram. Because of the location of the epiphysis, the secondary ossification centers are also called the epiphyseal plate. It is also called the growth plate or pressure plate because of the ends of the shaft where the pressure is placed during weight-bearing activities. Again, you will see that the blood supply develops in the secondary ossification center. As you can see in part 6 of this figure, as the bone grows in both of these ossification centers, the amount of cartilage separating the diaphysis, where the primary ossification zone is located, and the epiphysis, where the secondary ossification zone is located, begins to disappear. The epiphyseal plate eventually becomes a thin band of cartilage separating these two regions of the bone. Using X-ray, we can observe how much of the skeletal system is comprised of cartilage or bone. In the figure to the right, we see an X-ray of a 12-week-old fetus. The dark regions represent the bones that are starting to calcify. The translucent areas are the uncalcified cartilage. As we mentioned in the last slide, the epiphyseal plates are a layer of cartilage cells which eventually disappear, allowing the diaphysis to fuse with the epiphysis. The pressure epiphyses are located at the end of weight-bearing bones because the weight of the body puts pressure on these regions and stimulates bone growth. In addition to pressure epiphyses, traction epiphyses also stimulate growth. Traction epiphyses are located at the muscle tendon attachment sites on the bone. During periods of rapid growth or overuse, like in throwing or running, damage can be caused to the traction epiphyses. One example of this is Osgood-Schlatter disease, in which there is irritation to the patellar tendon, which attaches to the tibia. Another example is little league elbow, in which the traction epiphysis near the elbow is damaged because of forcefully overpronating the forearm, like in pitching. This injury is different than the ulnar collateral ligament damage that might require Tommy John surgery in adults, because the epiphyses have already closed. So this area of damage is slightly different. In adults, the ligament is damaged, whereas in children, the traction epiphysis is damaged. In addition to growth in length, the bones also experience growth in the girth of the bone. This is called appositional bone growth. We saw this kind of growth when we discussed the development of the medullary cavity on slide 5. Essentially, bone is deposited by osteoblasts under the periosteum, which is the membrane that covers the outside surface of the bone. This is similar to the growth that we see in trees. The medullary cavity is developed as osteoclasts resorb bone in the inner surface, thus increasing the diameter of the cavity. As we saw earlier in the figure of the fetus, we can use X-ray to determine the degree of ossification and estimate what's called the skeletal age. Skeletal age is estimated based on the degree of ossification in the wrist or hand of an individual compared to a template or an example. Template on the left is of a 48-month-old boy or a 4-year-old, and can also be used for a 37-month-old girl or 3-year and 1-month-old. Remember that typically females are more mature than boys at any given age. The template on the right is a standard for boys 156 months old or 13 years old, and girls 128 months old or 10 years and 8 months old. For a given individual, the skeletal age can be plus or minus 1 year around the chronological age. Recall that the chronological age is simply what we normally refer to as your age, meaning that it's the current date minus your date of birth. Across individuals, the skeletal age can vary by up to plus or minus 3 years for a given chronological age. This is due to the fact that individuals of the same age may be at very different stages of maturation. As mentioned, there are sex differences in the development of the skeletal system, which generally reflects the earlier maturation of females compared with males. Ossification centers appear earlier and close earlier in females, so the skeletal age is typically greater in females compared with males for any given chronological age. For example, the epiphyseal plates in the humerus closes around 15.5 years in females and around 18.1 years in males. Changes in the skeletal system continue after the closing of the epiphyseal plates. In adulthood, bone undergoes remodeling such that old bones are reabsorbed, allowing for new bone growth. However, bone growth slows during adulthood and cannot keep up with the rate of resorption. So the end result is a loss of about 1% starting in the mid-20s. In addition to growth, changes in the composition of bone also occur across the lifespan. For example, children have equal parts of inorganic and organic compounds in their bones. In contrast, older adults have more inorganic material, making their bones more brittle and more susceptible to breakage. As we saw with overall growth, the skeletal system is also sensitive to diet, hormone levels, and exercise. These factors influence bone growth and bone loss. For example, calcium supplements may help to lower the rate of bone resorption. With respect to hormones, estrogen stimulates osteoblast activity, which allows for bone growth. During aging, the combination of estrogen replacement therapy and calcium supplementation may help to prevent bone loss in postmenopausal women. Lastly, exercise may increase bone formation because of the mechanical forces increasing the bone density and thickness. Now let's change gears a little bit and talk about the developmental changes in the muscular system. It's important to keep in mind the changes in the skeletal system we just discussed, because typically we think of the skeletal and muscular system as a unit. As we mentioned, changes in muscle forces on the bone affect bone growth, and similarly, the changes in growth of bones will affect muscular growth. The basic contractile unit of the muscle is a sarcomere. Many sarcomeres create myofibrils. Many myofibrils are bundled together to create muscle fibers. And many muscle fibers are bundled to create what we typically think of as a muscle, for example, the biceps muscle. Sarcomeres are composed of thin filaments called actin and thick filaments called myosin. Cross bridges form when myosin pulls actin, contracting the sarcomere. Muscles grow by two mechanisms: hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Hyperplasia is an increase in the number of cells. Hyperplasia occurs throughout prenatal development and continues for a short period after birth. Hypertrophy is the increase in the size of the cells. Like hyperplasia, hypertrophy occurs throughout prenatal life. But after birth, hypertrophy is the primary way muscles grow and develop. Muscle accounts for 23 to 25% of birth weight. The sigmoid or S-shaped pattern of growth observed for weight that we saw in Chapter 4 is due to changes in muscle mass. Muscles grow both in diameter and length. Growth in length occurs through the addition of sarcomeres at the muscle-tendon junction, as well as results from the lengthening of the sarcomeres themselves. Sex differences in muscle growth are minimal during childhood, although muscle constitutes a slightly greater proportion of total mass in males compared with females. During adolescence, males increase muscle mass rapidly up until around the age of 17. Muscle mass is approximately 54% of total mass in adult males. There is also a greater rate of muscle growth in the upper body and arms, with up to 2 times the rate in males compared to females. There is less of a sex difference in the rate of muscle growth in the lower body. These sex differences are likely due to differences in hormones such as testosterone. During adolescence, females increase muscle mass until around the age of 13. Muscle is only about 45% of the total mass in females. There are 2 major muscle fiber types. Slow twitch, or type 1 fibers, are best for endurance because of their relative reliance on oxidative metabolism, which uses oxygen extracted from hemoglobin. Fast twitch fibers have several different categories: type 2A, type 2X, and type 2B. These muscle fibers are best for intense, short-duration activities because they are mostly reliant on glycolytic metabolism, or a combination of oxidative and glycolytic metabolism. There are developmental changes in muscle fiber composition. At birth, about 15% of the fibers have not yet differentiated into type 1 or type 2. And of the type 2 fibers, about 15% cannot be categorized at that time. By 1 year of age, the distribution of muscle fiber types is similar to that in adulthood. The muscular system undergoes a considerable amount of change during adulthood and aging. About 10% of muscle is lost between the mid-20s and 50s. Poor diet and low levels of physical activity both increase the amount of fat mass. Low physical activity levels lead to a decrease in muscle mass. So overall, the body composition of the amount of fat mass and muscle mass changes considerably. About 30% of muscle mass is lost by the age of 80. Moreover, for sedentary elderly individuals, up to 50% of muscle mass is lost by this age. The loss of muscle mass is due to a reduction in the number and size of muscle fibers. The loss of fibers is about 5% before the age of 50, but increases to about 35% after the age of 50. The loss in fiber size is not really evident until the 70s. Bone and muscle mass are related across the lifespan, so increased physical activity leads to an increase in muscle mass and an increase in bone growth. In addition to skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle also changes across development. Similar to skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle grows as a result of hyperplasia and hypertrophy. At birth, the right ventricle is larger than the left, but the left ventricle grows at a faster rate after birth. Overall, cardiac muscle follows the same sigmoidal or S-shaped pattern of growth observed for total body weight because the ratio of the heart to whole body size is constant. During aging, the ability of the cardiac muscle to adapt to increases in workload declines. This is due to the degeneration of cardiac muscle, decreases in the elasticity of the tissue, and changes in the fibers of the heart valves. In addition, the blood vessels supplying the heart with blood and oxygen, as well as the blood vessels transporting blood and oxygen to other parts of the body, loses elasticity and may become blocked. Together, these changes put individuals at increased risk for heart disease, heart attacks, and strokes.